Hello YouTube and welcome back to another video. This time I'm doing a video response to Dave, Imagamegeek. He was recently asking us, this is more of an entry to his competition, just wanting to know what our gaming history was. Now I have sort of spoken about my own gaming history in the past, sort of briefly, here and there. I sort of touched upon some of the early systems that I used to have. But I think this time I'm going to go a little bit more in depth, sort of start from the beginning and work my way to more current consoles. So bear with me. Yeah, let's get going. The first gaming system that I ever played was a handheld, and it was a Thomas the Tank Engine sort of LCD game. And I've told this story before, so I'll just touch upon it briefly. But essentially, I actually had it. I sort of got it around in the mid '80s. I was very, very young, and I actually had it well into adulthood, and it worked perfectly. It never broke down. It was well maintained, well kept. But unfortunately, it was given away to a family member by my mum. She sort of gave it away to a family member without telling me. So when I found out, I was really quite gutted. But there you go, that's what happens. But that was the very first thing I ever played. I sort of dabbled in a lot of the Game & Watches that Nintendo had back in the day. And I also tried out a few of the home computer systems as well. I don't really remember that much of them. But I do remember sort of dabbling on Commodore 64. I think I knew someone that had a Spectrum. I'm not too sure. I just sort of have very vague memories of that time. I remember I had a friend who had a lot of the cassette tapes. The reason why it sticks out to me is because I remember seeing a cassette tape of the RoboCop game, because it was made by Ocean. I think the reason why it sticks out to me is because I used to really like RoboCop as well. I still love it, but as a kid I really enjoyed that movie, and I always wanted to play the game. So I remember when I was looking at some of his cassette games, it was the one that sort of stood out to me. But I never really sort of owned any of these systems. It actually wasn't until in recent years that I found out that these home computers were actually very popular in Britain. Because I did know people that had these computer systems, but I wasn't aware of how popular they were. And the same goes for the Mars system as well. Like I never realised how popular it was in Europe at that time. But for me, I never got a Mars system. My very first console was the NES. I think I might have got the NES quite late in its life cycle, because I believe that when I got my NES, it was sort of around the time of the Mega Drive was just around the corner, and the Super Nintendo was a little bit further away. So I didn't have it for very long, but I only had like a very small selection of games as well. The packing game that came with my NES was Super Mario Brothers, which I loved to death. It was the first game that I completed. Really loved that game. And I only had 5 games for it. I had Super Mario Brothers. I had Super Mario Brothers 3. I had Mega Man 3. I had Wrath of the Black Manta, which is sort of like this side-scrolling ninja game. I had Captain Skyhawk, which is like sort of arcadey top-down shooter. And that was it. Yeah. Yeah, Mario Brothers, Mario 3, Mega Man 3, Skyhawk. Yeah, that was it. So I had 5 games. That's all I had. I had my best friend at the time. I'm still friends with that person today, but at the time he had an NES as well, and we sort of agreed. We sort of made this rule with each other that we wouldn't buy the same games. So like I had Mario Brothers 1 and 3. He had Mario Brothers 2. He also had Ninja Gaiden, which I actually picked out for him when we were kids. His dad took us to the game store, and I was actually the one that picked out Ninja Gaiden for him. So he had that, and he had a couple of other games as well. I think he had Off-Road if I remember correctly. And he had a couple of other games, but I don't really quite remember. But he used to loan them to me as well, so that's how I managed to sort of play those games. So I managed to complete Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3, because he loaned me Super Mario Brothers 2, and I in turn loaned him Super Mario Brothers 3. So yeah, I really loved the NES. Although I did have sort of negative memories of it as well. I remember having to constantly have to blow into my machine, blow into the cartridges, and startup issues were very common with the NES. I mean, we all know today that that's probably not the best thing to have done, but you know, when you're a kid, that's what seemed to have solved the problem. But moving on from that, I did have friends that had Master Systems, so I did get to play on the Master System as well. But it was quite strange. Like since I basically joined YouTube, I've sort of found out that the Master System was very, very popular in Britain, more so than the NES, which is really hard for me to sort of get my head around, because back then, I knew a lot of people that had NESs for the most part, rather than Master System. So at least from my perspective, it came across that the NES was a lot more popular. But yeah, so I managed to, you know, I played the NES. I owned an NES. I also owned the Game Boy. I think I got that around the time it came out. It was bundled with Tetris, like most people's Game Boys. And the game I also bought at the time with it was Super Mario Land. So I had that. I didn't have many games for the Game Boy. My original Game Boy actually was stolen, with Super Mario Land inside the Game Boy. So I still have my original Tetris, but yeah, those were long gone. But a few years later, I would end up getting another Game Boy with a couple more games. So I had a few games here and there, not that many for the Game Boy. I knew people that had Game Gears as well as the Atari Lynx. So I did get to play on those as well during my time as a kid. But primarily the Game Boy. The Game Boy was what really sort of what I played the most in terms of handheld gaming. Moving on to the 16-bit era. Now, I was, being a Nintendo kid, you know, it was only natural that I was going to move on to the Super Nintendo, but the Mega Drive came out first, and the game that convinced me to get the Mega Drive was Sonic the Hedgehog. That game to me just blew my mind at the time. Back in '91, that game was just amazing to me, and I just had to have it. So I jumped ship. I went with the Mega Drive. I don't regret it. The Mega Drive throughout the years was a fantastic system. Had so many great games for it. In terms of the games that I had for the Mega Drive at that time, I had because you know I didn't have I didn't get a lot of money to buy games, and games in those days were very expensive. So most of my games I had to trade them in to get other games. So I never really sort of kept the consistency of games. The only ones that I did keep that I still have to this day were RoboCop vs Terminator, which I bought from brand new. I also had Probotector, which is Contra Hardcore. I bought that from new. I also had Spider-Man Separation Anxiety, again, which I bought from new. But those games at that time were very expensive. And and Mortal Kombat as well, the very first Mortal Kombat. That was my mum bought me that for my 12th birthday, I believe. So those were the games that I did actually get from new, but the rest of the other games that I had were all sort of second-hand games that I would sort of trade in and so forth. So games I had were Streets of Rage 2, which I still, you know, actually I still have to this day. Mickey and Donald World of Illusion was another game that I bought used. Cool Spot was another game that I had that I bought used. Yeah, so I had quite a few games sort of here and there, but these are the ones that I still have to this day. At that time, I did have a lot of friends that had Super Nintendos, so I did manage to get a lot of time on the Super Nintendo. Back then, for me, it wasn't usual to have two systems at the same time. In fact, it's kind of a philosophy that up until very recently, where I've since become a collector, you know, I never really had more than one system at a time per generation. Like I've never owned, you know, a PlayStation 2 and an Xbox together. I always sort of followed the same mantra of one system per generation. That's just always been the way that I've done it since I was a kid. And back then, you know, it was not common for me to have friends that had both, you know, a Super Nintendo and a Mega Drive. You either had one or the other. So because I was a Mega Drive man, you know, the concept of the idea of me getting a Super Nintendo as well, it was not going to happen. My mum was not about to get me a Super Nintendo. You know, it was just me and my mum when I was growing up. So, you know, she couldn't afford to be buying me all these consoles. You know, I was lucky enough to get what I had. So, I did have friends that had Super Nintendos, and I had a couple of friends that were willing to swap with me for a time. And I had a friend of mine that loaned me his Super Nintendo, and I got to spend a lot of good time with Contra 3, Super Probotector, as well as Aladdin for the Super Nintendo. Strangely, I never actually got to play the Mega Drive version up until very recently. I was actually more familiar with the Super Nintendo version. And yeah, so I did get to spend a good time with the Super Nintendo. Yeah, and then going back to Sega, I kind of skipped out on the Mega CD, and I did get the 32X, which at the time I was very excited about, but I only ever got 2 games for it, and that was Star Wars Arcade and Virtua Racing Deluxe. Both games I loved, but as we all know, Sega didn't support the 32X and they abandoned it very soon in favour of the Saturn. And I remember being really annoyed by that, and that was the main reason why I actually abandoned Sega and I jumped ship to Sony. Because I was now sort of coming into my mid-teens around that time, and you know, which is sort of around the time of the introduction of the PlayStation. And you know, that sort of took off for me, and I became a very big Sony fan from that point onwards. But I still remain to this day. I have a Sony PlayStation. I had a Sony PlayStation. I've got a Sony PlayStation 2, and I currently have a PlayStation 3. And I do plan on getting a PS4 at some point very soon. But yeah, so I dabbled basically with the 32X. Sega abandoned it, so in turn I kind of left it. After the whole debacle with the 32X, I didn't feel confident getting the Sega Saturn, even though I initially did like the console, but I just didn't have the confidence in Sega. So I abandoned Sega, went with Sony with their new system, and I was really happy with it. It was a fantastic system. During the time of the PS1, I started working for the first time. I got my first job. So around that time, I was able to get earn my own money. So I started buying my own games for it myself. So I have actually quite an extensive PlayStation 1 collection from that time. Some of the games that I picked up during the PS1 runtime were such rare games today, like Strider 2, as well as Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Those were games that I picked up during its run. I'm a big 2D fighting fan, so I had a lot of the beat 'em ups. So I picked up Marvel vs. Capcom, Marvel Superheroes, and so forth. And I experienced my first proper cinematic game on the PlayStation, which was Metal Gear Solid, which still remains one of my favourite games of all time to this day. Such a fantastic game. Yeah, so just briefly leaving the consoles for one moment, I did actually, during the sort of early 90s, spend a lot of time in the arcades as well. Now, I'm not going to elaborate too much because I like to save this for another video, but essentially I did, during the sort of late 80s, early 90s, early to mid 90s, I used to go to the arcades quite a bit with my friends. And my genres of choice were 2D fighters, which is where I discovered Street Fighter 2 for the first time. Absolutely loved it. And the side-scrolling beat 'em up, which is when I played the Turtles, the arcade game, the original, as well as Final Fight, one of my favourite games in the arcades back in the day. Yeah, I got to experience a lot of those games, and it has to be said, the arcade was what really made me a hardcore gamer and very much into the arcade experience. Final Fight to me was an amazing game when I first played it in the arcades, as well as a Turtles arcade game. I just remember the Turtles 4-player arcade cabinet. It was just a fantastic experience playing with other people. It was just a brilliant, brilliant game. And Final Fight, for me, was just fantastic back then. There were so many other side-scrolling beat-em-ups as well that I played around this time. But I'm not going to elaborate them on this video because as I'm done with this video, I'm going to do another video very soon, which I'll explain at the very end. But moving on, I did play a lot of 2D fighters and Street Fighter 2, Samurai Showdown, Last Blade, you know, a lot of the SNK fighters, King of Fighters, Fatal Fury. My first experience with Fatal Fury was actually on the Mega Drive, but I sort of got into it more during its arcade run. But yeah, so that was my sort of brief sort of history with the arcade, which I will elaborate further another time. But yeah, so moving on, going back to the consoles, after the PS1, I did sort of play around with getting, I did think about getting a Dreamcast, because at the time the Dreamcast came out and it had a fantastic lineup. I really was going to get it off the strength of Soul Calibur, because on the PlayStation I had Soul Blade, which was the precursor to Soul Calibur, and it was a fantastic fighting game. It was probably the first 3D fighting game that I felt almost captured the immediacy, the speed of a 2D fighter. Because to me, 3D fighters at the time were very slow. You know, it's just because of the time period, they were still sort of working on it. I mean, today 3D fighters are a lot faster. They've come a long way since the 32-bit era. But in those days, they were sort of quite slow and cumbersome. And for me, Soul Blade was one of the sort of first sort of proper fast games that was in 3D, as well as Dead or Alive, which was another game that I used to play in the arcades that I loved, and yeah, that also sort of captured the sort of speed and fluidity almost of a 2D fighter, which I really did enjoy. So I almost got a Dreamcast, but in the end I decided to just wait for the PlayStation 2, and the main reason for that was because I found out that Metal Gear Solid 2 was coming out on the PlayStation 2, and because I loved the first game so much, that was really the deciding factor as to why I stayed with Sony and got into the PlayStation 2, which again, I've not regretted. I absolutely love the PlayStation 2. It's one of my favourite systems of all time. If you're a regular viewer of my channel, then you know that I have a very extensive PlayStation 2 collection, as you can probably see behind me. Yeah, so that was basically it with in terms of PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. And naturally, I was going to move on to the PlayStation 3. Again, it's one of my favourite systems. And I absolutely love it. I do. It's got some fantastic games for it. I'm playing a lot of games right now. Part of the reason why I haven't picked up a PlayStation 4 just yet is because I'm still working through a lot of the backlog of PlayStation 3 games that I have, as well as PlayStation 2 games. So I'm having fun right now. There's no need to rush out and get a PlayStation 4. I will get one at some point, but yeah. Yeah, and of course, you know, going back to handhelds, you know, I also own a PlayStation Portable, as well as Game Boy Advance. So you know, I do have sort of a nice selection of games for those systems as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it of my gaming history. A sort of very, very brief rundown. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will be making a video just after this, which is going to be a video response to the 16-Bit Brothers, and in that video I will be elaborating a bit more on my arcade experience, as it sort of more relates to the topic of that video. But for this, in terms of my overall gaming experience, that's pretty much, you know, the main part of it, really. You know, 8-bit run, NES, Nintendo, 16-bit, primarily Sega, 32-bit to now it's pretty much been Sony. So yeah, that's it. So thank you very much, guys, for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please give it a thumbs up. I would appreciate it. And of course, big thanks to Dave, Imagamegeek, for putting the question out. He wanted to know our gaming histories. So yeah, I was really glad to make the video. Sorry it's a little bit late. I've been a bit busy, so I haven't really had time to sort of sit down and make any videos. So, but you know, I've got it now. So yeah, thank you very much, guys, and I'll be back very soon with another video. Next video will be a video response to 16-Bit Brothers. So bye bye.